Hi everyone, I'd like to talk with you for a little bit about your portraiture assignment before you go out and shoot. There's a couple of considerations I'd like you to make. First of all, think about your choice of subject. This is a very, very important decision. You need somebody who's going to be relaxed with you, someone who's not going to rush you, and somebody who is interested in being photographed. Try not to choose somebody who you really have to convince to be photographed. It may not be the best choice of subject for you because you need someone who is willing to work with you. Number two, you want to choose your location ahead of time and have a backup location also planned if that first location doesn't work out quite like you thought it would or the lighting isn't quite right. Okay, number three, be sure not to have any distracting objects in the background. Obviously, the image here on this slide, there's a tree growing out of his head. We don't want that. We don't want cars, telephone poles, trees, objects growing out of your subject's head. Okay, we'll talk about aperture and how you can control that in just a few slides. Last week I had you look at famous celebrity photographer Annie Leibovitz. I want you to take some of those considerations, some of those qualities that you saw in her work, and think about how you might incorporate that into your portrait. This week I'm having you look at the work of Richard Avedon, also a famous portrait photographer. The image you see here is actually Ellen DeGeneres, and this is one of Annie Leibovitz's portraits. But she obviously has a wonderful style. She goes into her portraits with a vision of what that portrait is going to look like before she begins shooting. Okay, so that's a really important point. I want you to think about that. You're choosing your subject. Think about their natural expression. Think about their personality. What are you trying to bring out of them? What are you trying to show us about them? Why would you choose that person? And what is visually interesting about that person? What can we get out of that image? So these are all considerations to make prior to shooting. Let's talk about this image for a minute. This is also a work of Annie Leibovitz, and this was obviously for Rolling Stone magazine. It's John Lennon and Yoko Ono. What's pretty amazing about this image is that it's the last photograph taken of him before he was assassinated. He was actually assassinated the same day that this photograph was taken. But what I want you to take away from this as you think about the portraits that you want to take is look at the vulnerability he shows here. Look how he tells us so much about the relationship he has with his wife. Look at the visual pieces. Now they are more in the center, not really utilizing the rule of thirds, but look how his arm frames their faces and frames the kiss so that it tends to be the first place that you look in the image. But the expression of just complete vulnerability and love, and you really get a sense of the relationship between these two people. This is another image of Annie Leibovitz. This is Demi Moore. The trouble with celebrity photography is that these people have been photographed sometimes hundreds of times. So the photographer really has to go in with a unique vision of what they want their image to look like. So that's something, we've talked about a little bit, is having your vision for the particular image. Demi Moore was photographed with clothing on for Vanity Fair, but afterwards, after the regular shoot, she asked Annie if she would mind photographing just some of her pregnant body, some nude shots of her pregnant body, and they ended up using this on the cover. What I'd like you to know about this is that this caused so much controversy for Vanity Fair, but their circulation went up from 750,000 magazines to selling over 1 million magazines just based on this particular cover. So sometimes it's worth taking a risk. Okay, any guesses on who this celebrity might be? This is another photo by Annie Leibovitz. This is Whoopi Goldberg, and Annie asked her if she would mind being photographed in a tub of milk. And the reason that she asked her that was this was Annie's vision for this particular image. She wanted to show Whoopi emerging from a tub of white, or emerging from a field of white, because Whoopi Goldberg was one of the first female comedians, one of the first African-American comedians, I should say, coming from a field that was predominantly white men and women. So this was a very powerful image. Again, taking risks, having a vision for your particular image. What would really bring out something special about this particular subject that's being chosen? I'm not saying you have to put your subjects in a tub of milk, but I'm simply telling you about some of the ideas that photographers have had and taking a risk and how it's paid off. Let's talk for a minute about the work of Richard Avedon. You've looked at him this week in your Photographer of the Week, and I'd like you to think about the background choice, okay? We began discussing that at the beginning of this presentation. Richard Avedon was known for the stark white background. He photographed dancers, politicians, a lot of folks in a series called In the American West. What he did was place these subjects on this white background and then just began to photograph. He didn't really pose them. He didn't tell them the expression that he would like them to make, but it's very much his signature style. Avedon also photographed dancers, and what I want you to think about is this was in a time where he wasn't using digital, so this was a completely live shot taken with film. So every moment had to be precise, every movement had to be exactly in the frame as he had anticipated. So I want you to think about the amount of work it would have taken to achieve an image such as this. You can see, though, he's still using his signature stark white background. So we already get a sense that it's an Avedon piece. And lastly, before you begin photographing, I've had you look at Annie Leibovitz, and I've had you look at Richard Avedon, but when you look at portraits, what are you drawn to? Think about the pieces of that portrait that are significant for you. Is it eye contact? Is it lighting? Is it composition? Is it expression? Consider what you look for to begin developing your personal style. What do you admire about particular photographs? So those are also things to think about as you go into shooting your portrait. Have some ideas of what you want to do. Have a vision for what you want that to look like. It gives you a plan. It gives you a way to approach the scene and a way to approach the subject. And remember, if you are comfortable, your subject will be comfortable. If your subject senses that you are uncomfortable, they will follow your lead. Okay, so it's something where you can consider the phrase "fake it till you make it." If you're uncomfortable, try to just be as relaxed as possible so that your subject can relax and give you a nice, natural expression. Okay, so let's recap a little bit. Things to keep in mind while shooting your portrait. You're going to think about your choice of subject and make that selection very carefully. You want to consider simple backgrounds, right? No cars, trees, poles, that are going to distract the viewer from your subject. Okay, your subject is the story. You're trying to tell us something about that person. Consider their clothing. Simple clothing works best, okay? Clothing with logos, patterns, distracting colors may not be what you want. So clothing is a very important piece of that. You might want to consider asking that person to bring several things with them that if you need them to change, they could. What I'm looking for with this is a natural expression, okay? They're relaxed. Perhaps they're in their environment or an element where they feel very comfortable. Think about their body language. It doesn't have to be a head and shoulders shot. You could do a little bit more of their body. You want to try not to cut off their feet and cut off their hands. That's one of the general rules of photography. We're going to consider depth of field that we're going to talk about in just a second. And I'd like to see how effective you can make your eye contact, okay? The eyes are the pathway to the soul, right? So the viewer's going to connect with your subject through their eye contact. Very, very important piece to remember. This slide is just to remind you about the artist statement criteria. You have a 400-word minimum, and these are the pieces that I want you to address in your artist statement, your technical points, okay? What are your settings at? Your aperture, shutter speed, your ISO, and your white balance. What was the inspiration for your idea? How did you get to this point? Okay, how did that process unfold? Did you start with something else and then the idea changed or the subject changed? Explain your process. What was successful for you for this final image? What do you like about it? Why did you photograph this person in this particular scene or location? What are you most happy with? What would you adjust if you photographed again? Okay, what would you change? Are there things that bother you? Is there something in the background that you didn't see when you first photographed? Is the lighting not quite right? Tell me about those considerations. We're going to describe the composition. I want to hear from you. How are you using the compositional elements we discussed in week 2, okay? Are you using the rule of thirds or perspective or use of lines? Remember that you don't have to use all of those elements at the same time. You can pick and choose, but I want you to take into consideration how you're dealing with the overall composition. And then finally, what are the things that you did in Pixlr to enhance the image overall? So one of the most technical pieces that you need to take into consideration when shooting portraits is depth of field. Okay, depth of field is controlled by aperture. We're going to start talking about that with the last few slides, but this is something you're going to need to think about prior to shooting your portrait. In week 2, I introduced you to the idea of depth of field. Okay, and depth of field means the amount in your image that's in focus. Okay, if we focus on your subject and we blur out the background, and we have just a little bit in focus, it's considered a narrow depth of field. If we allow the entire scene to be sharp and in focus, such as in a landscape image, okay, we describe that as having a wide depth of field. Depth of field is controlled by your aperture. Okay, your aperture is controlling the amount of light coming in, but as your aperture settings change, so does your depth of field. At the f2 setting all the way to the left, this is one of the brightest settings you could possibly have if you have an f2 set on your camera. So a lot of light is coming in, but f2 is giving us a very narrow depth of field. As we move from f2 to 2.8 to 4 and so on and so forth, we're closing down our aperture. We're making our aperture size smaller. We're allowing less light to come in through the lens and hit our sensor, creating our image. As we do that, we're expanding our depth of field. So an image gets greater depth of field or wider depth of field as our aperture size decreases. Okay, so we have a nice wide aperture at f2. We have a lot of light, but we have a very narrow depth of field. As we go, let's say to f22, we have less light coming in. We have a wide depth of field. A lot is in focus. If it's too little light, we have to compensate with our shutter speed. Okay, if we need an f22 to get the depth of field that we like, if we're shooting a landscape, we need an f22 that's cutting our light down. So if our light is too dim, we have to compensate with our shutter speed by making our shutter speed slower, allowing the light to hit the sensor for a longer amount of time to compensate for that aperture. Let's take a look at this particular image. Would you describe this as having a narrow depth of field or a wide depth of field? If you said narrow, you were correct. The photographer is focusing on the red flower. They have an aperture of maybe an f2 or an f2.8. Okay, there's a lot of light coming in, but they have a very narrow depth of field because they have such a wide aperture. Okay, if there's too much light coming in on this scene, this photographer would have to use their shutter speed to compensate for the wide aperture. All right, so in f2, if that were too much light coming in, I would take my shutter speed. Perhaps it's set on 1/250th of a second. Okay, if I have an f2 and I have too much light, I'm going to make that shutter speed 1/500th of a second, or maybe 1/1000th of a second. I'm going to keep adjusting my shutter speed until I get the desired exposure that I want. So this is a narrow depth of field. This is shot with a wide open aperture like an f2 or a 2.8 in order to blur out the background. I'm going to show you an example of a wide depth of field with the exact same subject. Okay, so here's the exact same shot with a different aperture. This is shot with maybe an f16 or an f22. Notice how the background completely comes into play now and is a little bit distracting. All right, so if I'm using an f22 or an f16, my aperture size is very small. I've cut down the light, but I've compensated again with my shutter speed. Okay, if I've gone to an f22 and perhaps now my scene is way too dark, now I have to compensate with my shutter speed by taking it from, where did we leave off, 1/1000th of a second with the previous shot. Now I'm going to make my shutter speed slower. Okay, I'm going to go from 1/1000th of a second to 500th of a second. I'm letting more light in because my shutter speed is slower, so my shutter is open longer. Okay, maybe I have to go from 1/500th to 1/250th of a second. All right, whatever I need to do to compensate for my light is how you're experimenting. So this is shot at an f/22 or an f/16. This provides a wide depth of field. That means things in the background are going to start to come into focus. We don't necessarily want that with a portrait, so you want to consider having a wider aperture with your portrait.